Welcome. This is the first of the series of 3 lectures by invited speakers who share in various ways their agenda with art, design, and the public domain program, of which I am a so-called coordinator. In fact, there was one event already organized by our program, which was devoted to discussion on memory and monument, called September 11, Memory, Vision, and Practice. So we have 4 events altogether this year that are related to this topic, issue, public domain. So I owe you some explanation about this term, public domain. It's also because Mike Rakowitz, who is our first speaker this evening, who came from Chicago, originally New Yorker, said in one of his earlier interviews that when it comes to public space, the first thing I look at are the people. And then I think of the buildings as being the backdrop. Well, so the people. We used to this term public space, public sphere, public realm, but now we're talking about public domain. So I have to explain that it has nothing to do with copyright zone, which is also a term circulating in the electronic public space. Well, this public domain may include electronic public space, but in fact it's a way of life, of social relations of public space. It is seen as a place of exchange between and among individuals and groups. So the public domain is not a neutral, easy, quiet, well-managed space for so-called meetings and reconciling differences, a great fraternization, as they say. But an experience that emerges in an encounter, confrontation with the unfamiliar, an experience of alterity, of seeing things differently from other perspectives. In the public domain, one is provoked to relate to others. It's a space of friction. It's a place where one formulates own position while confronting and being confronted by others. So the myths, histories and memories from the point of view of cultural geography, that's what matters for thinking and making things in a public space. Of what's hidden, in fact, one must remember that the speech of the city is also a silence of the city. So one must learn how to listen to those silences as an art of one's research, as a starting point towards the new art for the new public domain. And I strongly believe, and that's what we are sharing here, hope that art and design can effectively and affectively contribute to sustainability of such public domain. So in exactly those ways, Michael Rakowitz makes a great contribution to this public domain. But doing so, he must accept the perception that his work is in a state of in-betweenness. It's situated between the professional and research fields and perceived with suspicion by so-called real artists and real designers or real social activists and social researchers. From a traditional designer's point of view, he may be seen as too much of an artist, but from artistic artist point of view, he appears to be too much of a designer. Well, we at the Art Design the Public Domain program, myself included, share with Michael this the membership of this land of in-betweenness. So, Michael, you're very welcome here, and you should feel safe and secure among us. No, he's Michael. He's American, Iraqi, and of a Jewish background with Polish or Ukrainian-sounding name. Being also himself an American Arab Jew, I think that provides condition and a potential qualification, if not obligation, to become both a cross-cultural nomad and critical agent. In 1998, he has initiated the paraSITE, an ongoing project in which custom-built inflatable shelters for homeless people attached to the exterior vents of buildings, heating, ventilation, air conditioning system actually provide a condition for them to be present. His work was also shown on various exhibitions: 16th Biennale of Sydney, 10th Istanbul Biennale, other enormous number of exhibitions, public and individual, but also he received National Design Award, a 2002 Grand Prix from UNESCO. So in fact, Michael Rakowitz received a very prestigious design award, a consequential award. We'll have to discuss then his approach to design upon reception of such honor. So his solo exhibition, "The Worst Condition is to Pass Under a Sword which is not one's own," was on view at Tate Modern, London in 2010. And his recent project, the Breakup, was presented by MoMA Foundation for Contemporary Art in Jerusalem in October. He is now working on his new commission to premiere at SALT in Istanbul in November. But let me also refer to something that Michael told me as an important reference in terms of his readings, the nomadology. One could see Mike as a special category of nomad, a critical cultural producer, archaeologist, investigator, but also a wandering smith. This is a useful kind of free artisan described in Deleuze and Guattari's nomadology. Equipped with his portable, mobile, socio-aesthetic workshop, he keeps crossing the borders and even moving along them to use and offer his design and artistic skills and know-how to interrupt, provoke new perception, emotion, imagination, experience, to bring to the realm of the visible the presence of those who have been kept in dark and forgotten, and of that which has been repressed, misrepresented, erased, stolen from history, even memory. So public space and public domain are both a site and a stake of Michael Rakowitz's work. His lecture title this evening is 3 Project, maybe 4. He told me that he will discuss among those 3 or 4 the recent and past project, and if time permits, he may present his work called "The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist," his ongoing attempt to reconstruct the archaeological artifacts looted from the National Museum of Iraq in April 2003. So in his own words, despite shortage of time, he will attempt to unpack the common processes of his various works while plotting its components. So on behalf of GSD and his host, the Art Design and Public Domain program, let me welcome Michael Rakowitz.
Thank you, Krzysztof, for that very generous and inspiring introduction. Now I feel I need to live up to your words. It's really a pleasure to be here, especially at Krzysztof's invitation. As many of you know, I had the pleasure and the fortune of working with Krzysztof at that other institution down the road. And it was really wonderful to experience him as a continuing mentor and also now as a really close friend and colleague and really family. So thank you for having me. I guess we're ready to show some images. Are we connected? Okay, great. So Krzysztof mentioned I'm going to be running through a few projects to articulate some of these ideas that run through each of them that are continuous and change from place to place and project to project, and hopefully pick up new information and becomes more and more rigorous. But before we begin with that, a statement. In 2008, I spent a great deal of time in Redfern, a largely Aboriginal neighborhood in Sydney, Australia, producing a project that involved Indigenous citizens and organizations from that community for the Biennale. I was struck by the overt racism in the city, the ongoing crimes against the displacement of Native Australians that were now about 241 years running. But there was something that was done as protocol that I felt kept the problems and failures visible and made them present, something I've tried to do in my own work for the past decade. In Australia, the acknowledgement of country is usually a statement or a speech made by an Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal to show respect for the traditional custodians of the land. I've often believed that the best way to forget someone important is to name a building after them, so their name disappears into an address, into an architecture. I'm sure that similar things have been said about the acknowledgement of country, but as an outsider, I was incredibly moved when I heard this preamble spoken at every public speech. I thought about my own context as an American living on Indigenous land taken from its original inhabitants. To live up to my commitment to the citizens of Redfern, I made a promise to myself that I would continue to remind those who had forgotten. Since my return to the US, I've begun all my public lectures with this, an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to the elders, both past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and the hopes of Native America. We must always remember that under the concrete and asphalt, this land is, was, and always will be traditional Indigenous land. I went to MIT in the visual arts program that was located within the Department of Architecture, and this was kind of a perfect problem for me. I'd always wanted to be an architect, but I wanted to be an architect without having to be an architect. I wanted to be the architect who didn't have responsibilities, and architects were always charged with solving problems, and it seems like that rarely worked out. And so I thought that I could maybe take it an extreme way in the opposite direction and become the architect who creates problems. And there's not much of an economy for that in the world. But like anybody who was interested in becoming an architect in the mid-90s, I was reading a book that everybody else was reading called City of Quartz by Mike Davis, which basically traces the evolution of Los Angeles into what he calls a fortress city. And there were some photographs in the book that spoke to me and showed me some of the roles of designers in the world, like, you know, somebody with a graphic design degree ends up working for the Southern California Grocers Association and designs anti-homeless billboards, invoking the Bible. And then the industrial designers get into the mix. In 1992, on the streets of Los Angeles, you have the appearance for the first time of a homeless-proof bench, the barrel-shaped bench. So lying down on it, you would simply roll off. In 1997, in January of that year, I was on residency in Kerak in Jordan. It was an architecture and urban design residency, and I was the only artist. So naturally, I dislocated myself from the group, and I found myself really researching the tents and the equipment of the Bedouin, the nomadic dwellers of the desert. And this research yielded some fascinating results. I learned that the pole structures that were used to give this structure to their tents was different every evening, that they actually mapped what was seemingly unmappable, the way the wind patterns moved through the desert. And it was almost like an aerodynamics where the structure and then the tensile that was over those poles, the carpets or whatever else, were positioned in a way that would allow for the shelter to withstand the pressure and the speed of the wind. And I found this result really poetic. I had no idea what I was going to do with any of this data. And then I got back to the United States, to Boston, in February of that year. And I was walking on Tremont Avenue, and I saw a homeless person in the dead of winter sleeping underneath this vent. And the warm exhaust from the building was keeping this person alive for the night. So this cosmology opened up in my mind, where I had this juxtaposition of these two different nomads, those who are nomadic by tradition in the experience of the Bedouin, and those who are nomadic by consequence, the homeless person or the urban nomad. And then these two conditions of wind. This was another kind of a wind that was being exhausted by the building, the byproduct of the building's service system, coming from one of the very things missing in a homeless person's life, which is some sort of edifice or architecture. And so all of this created really just the points that ended up inspiring this project that Krzysztof mentioned, paraSITE. That's an ongoing work where I construct these inflatable shelters for homeless people that attach to the exhaust vents of buildings. And so the warm air inflates and heats these double membrane structures. Now, this being a school environment, I'm often interested in unpacking how this project happened. And I was studying with Krzysztof at the time. It was a course called Nomadic Design. And, in any good class, there's a certain point of frustration that's reached. And, artists and architects, I found, do a really good job of talking each other out of one another's ideas. And in the classroom, I found that, even my production was really kind of naive and just a little stupid. In this pinup drawing that I did, I have no idea how a homeless person is going to gain roof access across from the Necco factory. So I started to become very frustrated in the sort of loop that these drawings were getting caught up in and critique. And after one frustrating day, found myself leaving the classroom and on my way back to my studio on Massachusetts Avenue. And I passed by a group of homeless men with whom I'd become familiar. And so I took the drawings out of my bag and I asked them, what do you think of this? Is this just academic bullshit, or is this something that we could work on? And they responded with a little bit of interest, and they just kind of said, meet us tomorrow at this municipal shelter where we stay. It's this place called Casper. It's on MIT's grounds. And I showed up that day, and what ensued was an episode that I come to refer to as the conference meeting. And there was a long table in the room, and 7 homeless men sitting on one side and then an empty chair on another. And they told me to sit there. And it was a very sort of cold and silent environment, and I didn't, quite know what was going to happen. And then finally, one of them spoke up and said, "So you're an architect?" At which point I started to fumble the way that I did at the beginning of the talk, saying, no, I'm not an architect. I always wanted to be an architect, but I'm an artist in an architecture program, and that's all they needed to hear. And they started to laugh, and they said, okay, well, if you're an artist, you're not so far from being like us. So there was this moment in which the tension had been cut through, and they said, that my not being an artist, my not being an architect was allowed for them to trust me more because I wasn't going to school to author buildings that they wouldn't be able to afford to live in. And after that, they came back to my studio, and I'd made my first prototype out of black trash bags and contact cement, and it really didn't look very good. It kind of looked like an inflatable hamburger or something. And this one guy, Bill Stone, spoke up, and he was trying to be gentle, and he said, okay, well, all right, why did you use black trash bags? And I said, well, I figured you would want privacy. And he says, well, this is where you've made your first big mistake. We don't have privacy issues. We have security issues. We want to see potential attackers, and we want to be seen. If we're going to participate in this weird project, what you have the opportunity to do is to move us out of the periphery of everybody's vision, where people can walk by us, and to move us into the center and force an engagement. And so this was really an important part of my education at MIT, was having this conversation and recognizing the fact that I wasn't coming to it as a designer with really any solid data, about how people exist on the streets. And for Bill, it was a very beautiful thing where visibility was somewhere on the road to equality. And at this point, I realized that my project had gone from being this kind of propositional project in a classroom environment to being something where my role as a designer was going to shift and change. And so with all the information that I was able to get from these different individuals, I started to design these projects, these shelters, customized. Listening to them tell stories about what it is that they needed and what they wanted, so their needs and their desires were represented in each of these shelters. So Bill, who gave me the critique about the black trash bags, wanted something that was kind of a dome shape, and he wanted as much visibility as possible. So he requested 2 sets of windows at 2 heights, one if he was sitting up, one if he was lying down. And he wanted it to be really light colored so that it would stand out in the sunlight. So this is the result of Bill's shelter. You can see the 6 windows that run the circumference at the height of his head when he's sitting and then when he's lying down. So it allows this kind of panoptical view to the outside. And I continued to use rubbish bags and weatherproof packing tape for reasons of the project operating as a kind of agitational element on the streets, that the people who pass by and see these readily available situations on buildings being appropriated by readily available materials, and with the enormous number of homeless people that occupy our cities, could these shelters take over like ivy? And in this case, I built this shelter. So everything was being built now for like a material budget of $5 and under. So it really communicated its accessibility. And this was built for a man named George Livingston, who was one of Bill's friends. And when he came to my studio, I showed him how I was working with a kind of an A-frame design. And I kept calling them air ribs. And he made the connection to the experience of eating ribs. And he said, well, the structure, the bones are what you throw away. It's the meat that's important. And he said, I want to be the meat. And so here you see the structural elements are these semi-translucent pieces of plastic, and in between we used this grid of Ziploc bags that allow for him to adjust levels of privacy and publicity. And it functions as a storage for all of his objects, and it also serves as a kind of reliquary for the passerby to see the different kinds of objects that are part of a homeless person's day-to-day existence on the streets. And there was one night in February of 1998 when a group of homeless guys that I was working with came to my studio door, and they were knocking on the door, and they said, "You've got to come quick. We found the vent that blows the hottest and the hardest in all of Cambridge." They actually started to map the city according to the warm air that was leaving buildings, and so it became this entirely new cartography of the city. And it actually ended up being the MIT Plasma Transfusion Laboratories, and they were able to get 2 shelters off the same vent that night. And then this is Bill on the left, George is on the right in the middle of Bill's shelter. And Bill on the left, George on the right, in the middle is Freddie Flynn. And Freddie's responsible for the most complicated shelter I've ever had to build in the 14 plus years that I've been doing this project. When I met with him, he said, "Bill and George told me you'll build anything I want," to which I replied, "Yeah." And he said, "Anything?" And what I didn't know that he was an avid science fiction fan, and he came back with this torn out piece of a magazine, and it had a picture of Jabba the Hutt, and he said, "I want to live in this." And so, like, I'm living out this childhood dream of, attempting to build a Star Wars character using plastic bags and air. And Freddie told me I did an okay job. And then when I moved to New York, the project moved with me. When the media found out about it, they positioned it against Giuliani, who was already agitating the homeless situation in the city, which seems to be nothing new. Every mayor seems to have an experience with the homeless that ends up creating a scandal. In this case, Giuliani had reacted to an attack on a woman who was hit by a man with a brick, and the man happened to be homeless. And so there was this knee-jerk reaction to enforce these laws that existed in the city's charter for a long time, which basically says that if you're homeless and you're found camping out on city streets, and the police ask you to move to a municipal shelter and you refuse, you'll be arrested. And this is like a law that just basically, to cut to the chase, says you'll be arrested for being homeless. Because in the winter months, homeless people would rather take their chances out on the city streets. The shelters are often the most dangerous places for homeless people. It's where the rapes occur. It's where the stabbings occur. It's where people are exposed to disease. And it's usually staffed by a social worker and a security guard. So, of course, they would prefer to not be moved to one of those places. And so the project existed for a long time before that, but there was media coverage of this that ended up becoming useful. In a couple of slides, I'll explain that. But to close out the New York cycle of this project, this is Michael McGee. And he was a homeless man who lived in the Herald Square area of New York City, right near Penn Station. He used to get hired by ticket scalpers to wait online for tickets outside Madison Square Garden. And he read the article in the New York Times and contacted me to build him his shelter. And he zeroed in on this one factoid in the article where the New York policeman's spokesperson had said that while the shelters were a nice gesture, they were in violation of New York City's anti-camping laws. And so Michael went to the New York City Public Library, looked up the anti-camping laws, and found out that they were attached to anti-tent laws. And the anti-tent laws, he said, were basically really murky in their language. They described a tent as something that was dome triangulated or other, that stood in excess of 3.5 feet, capable of housing a person inside. And so Michael wondered, well, what can we do? Like, there's this loophole that we should address. And so he brought it underneath that 3.5 foot limit and made it only 18 inches tall. In New York, I found that a lot of homeless people did want the black trash bags back. They wanted some privacy, so it wasn't simply a project that I did in one city, and the same concerns of these homeless citizens were the same. And he started to call it a body extension as we were talking about it, and he kind of looks like this mermaid attached to this building on 26th Street and 9th Avenue in New York City. And this is a 22-story residential building. And the police arrived. A policeman came barreling through the door of the building's lobby to the outside. And he said, I don't know what you guys are doing here, but somebody on the 12th floor said that something weird is going on down near the laundry room. And I don't know what you're doing, but you can't screw around with ventilation. You've got to move on. And so I left that up to Michael, and Michael decided, yeah, he'll go to another place and set it up. And at this point, he started taking down the shelter, and the policeman looked at Michael, he looked at the shelter, and he looked at me. He did a double take, looked at Michael, looked at the shelter, he looked at me. And he says, wait a second, you're the guy from the newspaper. And in this moment of misplaced pride, I say, yes, and like wanting the word back as soon as I mentioned it. And he says, hang on a second, I've got to call my commanding officer. He goes off onto this patch of green that's next to the building, and I'm telling Michael to run. And he's, whispering into his walkie-talkie, and I think he's like, we finally caught the bubble guy. And he comes back and he says, my commanding officer told me to tell you, you take all the time you need to take your photographs. Do you understand what I'm saying? You take all the time you need to take your photographs. And it was beautiful because in this moment, there was a loophole that Michael was trying to address, and this perceived antagonist in the city, what I thought the policeman would be, and it ended up enabling the project and finding a way to do that. And he actually went into an anti-Giuliani rant and then gave me a critique on what I could do to make the project better. And as this is all happening, Michael is one of the most gregarious and outspoken of the homeless people that I've worked with in the last 14 years, and he's actually no longer homeless. He runs his own cleaning company in New York City now. But at this point, he's like engaging the people who've come out of the building to find out why the police are in front of the building and what's going on. And he used to carry around a dossier with him that had the articles from the New York Times, and he would whip out my 72-page thesis from MIT for anybody who stayed long enough. And so here he is kind of negotiating the project in relation to these people who are living inside. And this beautiful inversion ends up happening where Michael is able to get this woman named Jane to get inside the shelter and to see, the city from his position. And so, Christoph mentioned that I'm doing this as an ongoing work, and one of the reasons is that, everybody who I work with has a different story. And it was one of these intangibles that really did not come into sharp focus at the very beginning of the project's life. But a project that was so much about architecture has become also about portraiture. And so I'll end the project on this proposal for Artie and Myra, the first couple that I built for. And he calls her his wife, and he requested a shelter that had a bubble, and then a low-lying area where Myra would sleep, and he called it the lovin' room. There, he and Myra would sleep, and the lovin' room is the lovin' room. And about halfway through making this, I get a call from Artie saying that I have to adjust the design, that it's just not going to work. And I ask him why, and he says, Myra talks way too much. So what we need are two sitting areas and the lovin' room in between, so it should look like a bra or a dog bone. So even in these spaces of urgency and marginality, there's still love and there's still humor. And one of the things that happens with this project, something happens every year, and a couple of years ago I started to publish the instructions in homeless magazines and newspapers that are sold around the world. There's usually an editorial of the project that's accompanied, it accompanies the setup of the design from different homeless authors, and so the discussion of the project gets put back into to that community, and also shows that the materials and the technologies are very accessible and attainable. So I'm not going to show this project. Nice cars. How are we doing on time? Are we okay? So we have how much longer? 45 more minutes. Okay, so we can talk about this project. Okay, very briefly, I'll talk about this work and thinking about ways to go from the outside to the inside. I was invited in 2001 to participate in an exhibition at Lafayette and Canal. And it was this building that was, I guess, 11 or 12 stories tall. And it was a building that had been recently vacated. It used to hold Chinese banquet centers, Chinese dentist offices, Chinese labor unions. It was in the heart of New York's Chinatown. And it had come under new ownership from a different real estate company, and they raised the rents double. So it was a de facto eviction of all these really important community organizations and meeting places. And so their intention was to develop high-rent condos that would enable them to gentrify this area of New York City. So naturally what they did is they approached art organizations and asked them to put up a temporary exhibition. And I was asked by two curators who worked with the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council at that point to be part of their floor, which I guess was like the 9th floor of the building. And I couldn't understand why they had asked me to do this. And in the conversation with Christoph's class before, the question came up about when to refuse and when to agree to do something that you don't necessarily want to do or believe in doing so that you can make like a Trojan horse. And so I knew that I had willing collaborators in making a Trojan horse. But I really didn't know about this. So I went down and I visited, and I went up to the 9th floor of the building, and it was just, you know, it looked like the perfect art space, like white walls, wood floors, you know, it's like I could live there or I can make a work there. And so I walked to the window and I smelt something that was vaguely familiar. It was like sort of sweet, but like not totally something that I grew up with, and it smelt a little bit, you know, out of place, but in place. So I then did a walk around the adjacent streets to the building, and one of the streets was Center Street. And across the street from where I was standing, I saw this place called Fidar Bakery. And Fidar Bakery is a very important bakery in that part of the city. It's a meeting space for kids after school. People go there on dates on the weekends. It's a meeting space for the Chinese community. And I walked in and I told them, you know, I was doing research and that I'd been invited to be in this contemporary art exhibition that they were putting up in this building, at which point the people who were there had, you know, responded very angrily and said, you know, what is this all about? You know, there used to be the place where I got married was there, and, you know, my dentist was there, and, you know, now there's a contemporary art exhibition that has nothing to do with us. And so I said, yeah, this is really important for me to hear. And so then, you know, the people who owned the bakery gave me a little tour of this very little bakery. There wasn't much to see, but they brought me back into the kitchen to see what they were making. And the baker was making these sweet buns. And right behind the baker, I saw exactly the source of the smell that I was smelling on the 9th floor, which was the central oven duct, the hood that was over the ovens. And so I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And so that night I went home and I did the most absurd drawing I've ever done. And the proposal was to extend the central oven duct up 125 feet into the 9th floor of the building where I was going to be part of this exhibition. And they gave me the keys to the roof. And so this is the result. It's 125 feet of flexible aluminum duct that travels up the side of the building and into the open 9th floor window, with a booster fan, and throughout the duration of the exhibition, it filled the space with the smell of Chinese pastries as they were being baked. And the Chinese bakery showed up that night with 600 little pastries as a sort of thank you for the free advertising, so people who visited the exhibition could actually eat what they were smelling. And so what happened during the exhibition was a lot of people who visited the artwork were ended up in that bakery at the end, and ended up, you know, able to have conversations with the people in the community. And there isn't some triumphant end to the story here. You know, the exhibition happened, and, you know, and then they weren't able to sell any of the building's floors, and then they just sold it to another real estate company, and now I think they are like high-end, you know, lofts that people can rent. So from invisibility and marginalization on city streets to invisibility and marginalization in museums. These are images that were taken in April of 2003 of the Iraq Museum after the US invasion and after the looting of the museum's galleries. In September 2006, I went to Berlin for an exhibition and ended up visiting the Pergamon Museum, which I had known through its notoriety of housing the Pergamon altar, which was taken by the German archaeologists and brought from Bergama in Turkey, and then represented in this museum in Berlin. What I didn't know was that the Pergamon Museum also housed the Ishtar Gate, which is the magnificent central feature of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, built in 545 BC. And the blue brick structure served as the main entranceway and endpoint of the processional way called Aji Bor Shapu. And this was the avenue that was used by the Babylonian priests and the people to carry the statues of the gods to the temple of Akitu in the north, a temple that was built in honor of the god Marduk. So people would travel with these statues back and forth on this New Year's celebration. And the bricks were excavated, or the gate was excavated brick by a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey from 1899 until 1914. And it was brought back to this museum in Germany, and any missing bricks were built by the museum staff and preparators, so that when they installed the gate, it could give the sort of like, the sort of full-scale experience of what it would look like in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. And the name of the street that passes through it, like I said, in ancient Babylonian, it's called Aji Bor Shapu, which translates to mean the invisible enemy should not exist, which is like the coolest name of a street that I've ever heard. And it's also the title of this project. This is the Ishtar Gate as it stands now in modern-day Iraq, in Babel province. And this one is built out of plaster, plywood, and 2x4s. It was reconstructed in the 1950s by the government of Iraq to replace what had been taken by the Germans, and was supposed to stand as the entranceway to a museum that was actually never built. It's now become one of the most famous, or one of the most popular photo opportunities for American soldiers who were stationed in Iraq. In fact, this is the first image that comes up on Google Images when you put in Ishtar Gate. So an American soldier stands in the middle there and moves away, and then others, take his place. So this story it introduces the project through drawings that are exhibited in a museum gallery. And they're done in this kind of way that an archaeologist might have been marking up their diaries. So the story about the Ishtar Gate is represented, and then the excavation by Robert Koldewey, and then the excavated portion of the gate being relocated to Berlin. In going from the reconstruction of the gate, we also learned that during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, President Saddam Hussein began a massive reconstruction project atop the partially excavated ruins of Babylon. And despite protests of archaeologists all over the world, the project was expansive. It included a recreation of the Temple of Nebuchadnezzar with bricks bearing the inscription, "This was built by Saddam Hussein, son of Nebuchadnezzar, to glorify Iraq." In 2003, U.S. Marines established a base on the site and built a helipad close to the ruins. Iraqi archaeologists complained that military vehicles were crushing the bricks of ancient structures, the wind from helicopters blasting ancient walls. Coalition forces agreed to close the base in 2004, but they didn't actually close it until 2007. The National Museum of Iraq is known for housing one of the world's great collections of ancient artifacts, including the Warka vase of Uruk from the 4th millennium BC, thousands of ancient stone cylinder seals, monumental Assyrian reliefs from royal palaces of the 1st millennium BC, and a vast collection of inscribed clay tablets that are among the earliest examples of writing ever found. The Iraq Museum was pillaged from April 10th to the 12th, 2003, shortly after the fall of Baghdad. Display cases were emptied, dropped artifacts were damaged, and storage vaults were robbed. Many missing items have since been recovered through international policing and amnesty for looters. Each returned object is photographed on a long wooden table among all other recuperated goods, the resulting photos serving as a visual archive. Fakes, as well as reproductions that were sold in the museum's gift shop, have also been brought back. Dr. Donnie George served as the president of Iraq's State Board of Antiquities and Heritage and the Director General of the National Museum in Baghdad. In the aftermath of the museum's looting, he worked tirelessly to help recover some 50% of missing items. However, because the museum continues to be a soft target for insurgents, international policing agencies from Kuwait and Iran to Japan, Italy, and the US are for now retaining any confiscated museum objects. Under Saddam Hussein, Dr. George worked at archaeological sites in order to avoid Ba'ath Party meetings. Now, this was really incredible because in order for him to hold the position that he held in Iraq, he had to be a party member. But it was not protocol for the director of a museum or a researcher even to decline attending party meetings, but he'd be telegraphing in from like some archaeological site out in North Iskandaria and say, I'm sorry, I can't be there. I'm, excavating a ziggurat, And this was his way of circumventing, this power that he didn't believe in. Dr. George also sidelined as a drummer in a band called 99%, short for 99% of Excellence, that specialized in covers of Deep Purple and Pink Floyd songs. Now, this is where I really fell in love with the man. This was really like indicating to me that he was an artist. Deep Purple's Smoke on the Water recalls a disastrous fire during a 1971 Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention concert at a casino in Montreux, Switzerland. A fan shot a flare gun inside the venue, a fire ensued, and the entire building was destroyed. Members of Deep Purple watched the events unfold across Lake Geneva in a mobile studio on loan from the Rolling Stones. You can get all that information from the lyrics, actually. After receiving a letter with a bullet enclosed from extremists who threatened to harm his family if a ransom was not paid, Dr. George resigned his post, fleeing to Syria in August of 2006. In December of 2006, Dr. George arrived with his family in the United States, having accepted a position as a visiting professor in the Department of Anthropology at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. Ahlan wa sahlan, Dr. George. So as I mentioned, these drawings are presented on the walls of the museum space. So it runs the periphery of the exhibition. And in the center, you're going to see a table. And that table is based on that wooden table that I described before, where the stolen artifacts were brought back, and members of the U.S. Army and archaeologists who had been brought in as a task force ended up taking those photos as a kind of continuing archive of everything that had been brought back. So this is that wooden table, and on top of it are these reconstructed artifacts that I'll talk about in a second. But just a little design detail, you'll notice the bend in the table, and that bend is meant to reference the trajectory of the avenue that ran through the center of the Ishtar Gate. So the artifacts are reconstructed to scale using the packaging of Middle Eastern foodstuffs and Arabic-English newspapers that one finds in the United States where there is an Arab-American community. So it's about these objects being reconstructed from these fragments of cultural visibility to recreate these things that are for now, for all intents and purposes, invisible. So we mentioned public domain. Christoph, I know you mentioned the electronic version of this word is not totally what you were getting at, and I'm not talking about copyrights either, but the research that I do is based largely online at the Oriental Institute, which is part of the University of Chicago. They've had a relationship with the Iraq Museum since its inception. So they have photographs of everything that was in there. And in the moments after the looting, they went live with this archive and this database of the artifacts for two reasons. One was to educate the public on the amount of human cultural heritage that had just been wiped off the face of the earth, potentially. And the other was to deter antiquities collectors from buying things on the black or the gray market, and it was almost like being able to compare what somebody offered to you with the photograph that they had online. So it was like, you know, missing children photographs on the backs of milk cartons in that sense. So you click on one of these numbers and up comes a photograph, and the museum number, the excavation number, the provenance, everything, a description. And then there's multiple views, which really makes a sculptor's job pretty easy. So like I said, they're constructed to scale. And so one other element of this project that I'll talk about right now is reconstructing these things, and so it ends up being this form of covering. And one other cover that's in the exhibition is the sound element, which really kind of encapsulates the entire environment. I mentioned that Donnie George was a member of this band called 99%, which played these Deep Purple covers. And so what I did is I commissioned an Arabic-style cover of Deep Purple's Smoke on the Water that plays on a loop in the exhibition. So I'll let you hear some of that right now. And the band is called Ayub, for those of you who are interested. They're amazing Brooklyn-based Arabic fusion band. So instead of the Richie Blackmore solo guitar, you have Tawfiq Ben Amour with that amazing saz solo. So the artifacts are displayed along with a card, which is not uncommon in archaeological collections, to display an accession card with things like the museum number, and then a description of what the artifact actually was. But instead of doing this, I listed all that relevant information, but instead of describing the artifact, I took fragments of statements and conversations from different people around the world who were reacting to the looting of the museum. So what you end up with is this kind of fragmented conversation across the table, where you have some of these people, some of them unlikely to be speaking to each other in this kind of call and response. So examples, this one was accompanied with a statement from Fiorella Strica: the Gulf Wars had the single positive result of awakening international interest for the culture of Mesopotamia. And then Satan's favorite poet, Donald Rumsfeld: let me say one other thing. The images you are seeing on television, you are seeing over and over and over, and it's the same picture of some person walking out of some building with a vase, and you see it 20 times and you think, my goodness, were there that many vases? Is it possible there were that many vases in the whole country? And then some information that one wouldn't assume comes to the forefront, where Donnie George talks about this artifact. This piece has a very nice story. It was taken by two young men during the looting. They took 9 very nice pieces to their houses. They came to us after the looting and they said, don't ask us for our names or our addresses. We were in the museum at the time of the looting. We felt very sorry because we could not stop anything. Then they decided they would take things and bring them back when it was safe, and they did it. As soon as we had the American soldiers protecting the museum, they brought back the 9 pieces. And then these 2 artifacts have kind of anchored the table for me, where the 2 of them are accompanied with their own accession card. And so one of them is a statement by Lamia Al-Ghalani Ware, who says, some 10,000 years of human history were destroyed, and today it is no more, answered by William Polk. And so this is a project that has continued since 2007 and will continue probably past my lifetime in the studio. There's over 8,000 artifacts that are still at large and probably won't be found. To date, we've made over 300 artifacts, but this is clearly a project that will outlive my studio, as this impossibility of being able to put together any replacement for this history that's now gone. And so I actually had the opportunity to meet Donnie George. What ended up happening was I started this project in the fall of 2006, and he was already en route to the United States, and I had no idea how to handle this because I'd started it and he was going to arrive, and he'd come like escaping for his and his family's life, and here's this artist doing this strange project about him. And he actually he contacted me, and I went to this welcome brunch for him when he came to the U.S., and he was really excited about the project, and he asked me about this one image in the exhibition and wondered, how I got a picture of him playing the drums, that he had seen the headline in the art newspaper, which had followed his story from the beginning, which was the story revealed Donnie George rock star, and it had the drawing, and he said, how did you get a picture of me playing the drums? And there's no Google images of 99%, there's no YouTube videos, there's no MP3s. And so I explained, this is what I do. I'm trying to make these images of histories nobody's been around to see, or people, haven't documented. So, I took a picture of you looking kind of bored at a meeting, and then a picture of this guy, and through the magic of Photoshop, created the base image for this. And he said, well, that's archaeology too. And so when the exhibition was in New York, I wasn't there when this happened, but this was a very beautiful thing that my gallerist had sent me pictures of. He went to the exhibition and was looking, and then this group of gallery goers came in, and he ended up giving this impromptu tour of the artifacts the way that he would have given it in Iraq if he was still there with his own collection. And these are particularly difficult images to look at because Dr. George passed away in March while giving a talk, or en route to give a talk in Toronto. But these images mirror the ones that you would find online of him presiding over his collection in Iraq. And, you know, he explained to me that he got very emotional about the project, and when I asked why, he said, well, you know, these are as close as I'm ever going to get to these artifacts again, because he had left Iraq knowing that he probably wasn't going to return, and knowing that these artifacts probably weren't either. So the last project I'm going to speak to you about tonight is this project called Return, which is a storefront that I opened during the fall of 2006 on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, which is the heart of New York City's Arab American community, with the help of Creative Time. And Gavin Krober, who's in our audience, was essential in making it happen as a producer. The storefront operated from October until the end of December of that year. The story begins with my mother's family, and I'm going to apologize for this part of the talk because I have to read it. This is one of the more sort of unwieldy projects that I've done that incorporates the narrative dissemination of the work. It's one of the heavier pieces that I've done, and so in order to keep things confined within our time frame, I'm going to read it, but hopefully not appear too wooden. So the story begins with my mother's family, who were forced to leave Baghdad in 1946, and eventually they emigrated to New York. This photo shows my grandfather, Nissim Isaac Daoud bin Aziz, with his family, so large that they extend beyond the frame as provided by the desert oasis backdrop. This next photo shows my grandfather on the right, his younger brother Salim on the left. Beginning in the 1920s, my grandfather owned and operated an import-export company called Davisons & Co. When the family came to the United States in 1946, he reopened the company in New York City, and his first parcels were sent between Iraq and the United States. He closed the company in 1963 and died in 1975. In the fall of 2004, I participated in an exhibition in New York City that invited artists to produce site-specific works within various commercial spaces and storefronts. At the time, I'd been reading media accounts about the progress 1 year after mission accomplished. The reports were, of course, pessimistic and served to expose the infrastructure that had fallen apart as a result of the war, including that of shipping and trade. So in response to this, I decided to reopen my grandfather's import-export business in a fairly symbolic way. I became the new proprietor and created a drop box, pictured here, that featured the original typeface and layout of my grandfather's letterhead. I used the project budget to provide free shipping for Iraqi citizens living in the U.S., inviting them to send an object of their choice, free of charge, to an address in Iraq. And during this time, I sent a total of 3 things. One was a Nokia cell phone battery that somebody had bought on eBay and decided to forward onto the receiver in Iraq, where they weren't able to get that cell phone battery anymore. Another was a bootleg copy CD-ROM of Windows Office 98, and the other was a paperback novel. So in this way, they ended up being these portraits of the sender or the intended receiver. So when I initially proposed Return as a storefront to Creative Time, in addition to the gesture of shipping items, I wanted to try importing something clearly labeled as product of Iraq. I'd wanted to investigate this new facet since August of 2004, when I discovered a large red can of date syrup at Sahadi Importing Company on Atlantic Avenue. Sahadi's was one of the stores my grandparents frequented when they first arrived in New York. I brought the can of date syrup to the cash register, where the owner, Charlie Sahadi, said, "Your mother's going to love this. It's from Baghdad." I looked at the label, which was clearly marked product of Lebanon. And that's when he told me that the date syrup is processed in the Iraqi capital, put into large plastic vats, and then driven over the border into Syria, where it gets packed into unmarked aluminum cans. It then crosses the border into Lebanon, where it receives a label and is then exported to the rest of the world. From 1990 until May of 2003, this was one method that Iraqi companies had used in order to circumvent the UN sanctions. When I asked why it was still in place in August of '04, more than 1 year after the sanctions had been dropped, Charlie replied that prohibitive customs and security charges were to blame. Importing products directly from Iraq was just too much of a risk. It would be bad business. So after this impromptu first lesson on importing, I decided to investigate further the history of Iraqi exports beyond oil. The date syrup led me to dates, which were legendary in Iraq, renowned as being the best in the world with a yield of over 600 different varieties. In the 1970s, Iraq was the world's chief exporter of dates, and dates accounted for their second largest economy next to oil. At its peak in the mid-70s, the Iraqi date industry listed over 30 million date palms in the country. By the end of the Iran-Iraq War, this number was halved to about 16 million. At the end of the 2003 invasion, only 3 million remained. So together with Sahadi Fine Foods, whom I was able to get interested in my project, in my bad business as good art, I went ahead and signed a deal with an Iraqi company, Al-Faraz, to import 1 ton of Khastawi dates from the city of Hilla. It was the first such deal in more than 25 years. The dates were to be, and one thing that you can notice here in the contract, you'll see it says Michael Daoud Rakowitz. Daoud is not my middle name. When I would get on the phone with the Iraqi companies and talk to them, they asked me what my grandfather's last name was. When I told them it was Daoud, they would say, "Welcome back, Daoud," and many of them preferred to refer to me by this name. The dates were to be clearly packed in boxes the dates were to be packed in boxes clearly labeled product of Iraq. And so when I told the company that they could say whatever they wanted to say to the American public with the design of the box, they got very excited and they came back with something that was wonderfully crazy. So in the midst of these swaying palm trees and these bunches of dates which are mysteriously hovering in midair, there's an art history lesson. On the top left-hand side, Babylon, Iraq, the caption just simply says "genuine lion." On the lower right-hand side, Babylon, Iraq, Ishtar Gate reconstructed. That was taken by a foreign power to put in their museum, but that lion still remains. And they even go so far as to print the flag. And they were very excited by this box. So when the boxes came back from the printer, I ended up getting emails with all these different JPEG attachments. And, it was like the box with the top on the office table, the box on another office table with the top off. And, and I ended up getting a tour through their office with this, with these JPEGs. But with the transaction came communication. And with that communication came friendship. When I first corresponded by email with Athir, the general manager of Al-Faraz, he explained to me that my fascination with dates must come from my mother's side of the family, as it's said that every Iraqi has a date in their genes. He wrote that in the first moments of life, it's traditional for parents to place a date in the mouth of the newborn baby, so the first taste of life is sweet. Partway through our transactions, I learned that Athir and his family had to leave Baghdad because it was becoming too dangerous. His wife and kids had witnessed a man being shot right in front of them while they were at a restaurant. So suddenly, the conversations we were having became that of two exiles. Athir would tell stories of Iraq, of what it looked like, what men al-Sema tasted like, how thick the trunks of the palms would get. At one point, he realized the way he was speaking and sighed. "Do I sound like your grandfather yet?" The dates came down off the tree, and Al-Faraz sent me pictures of the harvest. Now, this was another really great email JPEG moment. I would end up opening my email in the morning with some sort of progress, and it turned out that the farmer was climbing the tree every day and taking a picture of the dates as they ripened, and I would end up with a message like, "Here are how your dates are doing today, okay?" And so this image is particularly wonderful because you see all the different stages of the ripening process in there, going from green to yellow to the tamar stage, the date that we all know. And so these are pictures of the harvest, the farmers climbing the tree, taking the dates down, the women sorting the dates going into those boxes. That's the farmer's son. And then this is 1 ton of dates in a storage unit in Baghdad, ready to ship to Brooklyn. So they were packed and ready to ship by truck from Baghdad to Amman, Jordan, by the beginning of October. From Jordan, they were to receive a direct flight to JFK Airport. This type of freight was prohibitively expensive, but I had cultural money to work with, the only way to really make this business transaction possible. The truck traveled along the highway between Baghdad and Amman, which is the most dangerous road in the country. It waited in a line of cars at the border with Jordan that was reported to be 4 days long, as hundreds of thousands of Iraqis tried to flee the worsening sectarian violence. Having finally reached the checkpoint, the Jordanian border guards informed the driver that he needed a radiation scan certificate, declaring the dates free from contamination. This seemed to corroborate the belief that depleted uranium was used during the war. The truck returned to Baghdad, got its certificate from the Ministry of Environment Radiation Protection Center, returned to the border, waited another few days, and then this time the Jordanians flatly refused the cargo, stating it was a security concern. The truck driver then headed north to Syria, drove right through the border, and dropped off the dates in the airport in Damascus, where the new plan was to get it on a plane to Egypt, then onward to the USA. The shipment was held for a week and was then discovered to be so blistered from the 3 hot weeks in the truck that Al-Faraz deemed it unacceptable for export. So the shipment died in Syria. Meanwhile, the storefront opened in October, while the dates were wending their way along this impossible journey. Without any Iraqi dates to sell, I temporarily offered 4 varieties derived from Iraqi seed and grown in Mecca, California. Also available in the store were cookies and date syrups made from Iraqi dates but labeled as products of other countries. Now, this one's really interesting. It's called Basra date syrup. We all know where Basra is. That's a promo photo that the Iraqi date industry uses to illustrate their harvesting methods. This says product of Netherlands. I've never seen a date palm in Holland. And there was date cookies, and every time you see a date cookie, it's 99% Iraqi dates. These are the second house cans once again. And customers could buy these products and also learn about their shipping and packing narratives through wall texts. A timeline explaining the history of dates from ancient times through the present was presented as a mural in both English and Arabic. But most importantly, the story and its daily updates were communicated to customers, many of whom stopped in repeatedly to ask when the Iraqi dates would arrive. The dates suddenly became a surrogate, traveling the same path as Iraqi refugees, who are themselves mostly turned away by Jordan, and who then try their luck in Syria in an attempt to get to Egypt. Tragically, many never reach their destination. Initially, my belief was that the critical moment of the project was the ability of the imported dates to interrogate the restrictive laws that inhibit Iraqi items from entering the U.S. market, which are seemingly absurd laws when you consider the U.S. government's high-profile programs for rebuilding Iraq and rehabilitating its economy. But suddenly, my business was instead telling a story, or illustrating a story that most people in the States were not hearing at that time, and the store was a place where that crisis and its affiliated narrative was being disseminated, hardly the exchange a customer would expect. Customer reactions were as layered as my gesture of opening the store, with many speaking from the position of nostalgia and memory, which always seemed to be a window into the pain or the trauma of having to leave Iraq or being unable to return in the current context. A man named Shamoun Saleh, who left Iraq in 1960, came in many times. Seeing all this makes me nostalgic, sad, confused, and sick to my stomach, he told me. When we left, things were already bad, but look at what this country did there. It's unbelievable, a disaster. On another of Shamoun's visits, I discovered the whereabouts of the dates, at that point unknown. Shamoun said, "I'd appreciate it if you could just hold on to a handful for me, just a little something for Tikra." Tikra, he explained, means memory, nostalgia. It's for when you're homesick, he said, when you miss your home. The project also functioned as a social platform between customers. Joseph El-Khalasi came into the store because he was interested in working with an Iraq-based company to import different types of wood or other materials through his family's company in Beirut, Lebanon. While there, he met Ibrahim and Omar, who had come in to speak with me about the security requirements for preparing an export to Iraq of white American paint, a much sought-after commodity. They began speaking among themselves in Arabic and exchanged contact information, having determined that there might be some business possibilities between them. Their relationship is ongoing, and I should state that Ibrahim, who's on the right over here, is from Kurdistan. He's from Erbil, which is a city in northern Iraq. Another kind of customer interaction occurred when Hana Ali and her family came to the store to ship boxes of household items and toys to their relatives in Diwania. A cousin there had been taken by a group of men in tracksuits who said they were bringing him in for questioning because he had been seen speaking to American soldiers. His dead body was found the next morning. People in Diwania were now fearful of going out because to go out meant crossing a U.S. checkpoint, which meant having to talk to an American, which was now an impossible risk. While she and her family were packing up their goods, an American couple walked in. Hannah immediately asked them what they thought of the news, then current, that Saddam Hussein had been sentenced to death. A discussion ensued that lasted over an hour. There were many other such interactions. So in this way, the project began to function as a community space and a social network where my presence could recede and customers were not reacting to me but rather to each other. The possibility of their meeting facilitated and choreographed through the appearance of this strange store. After the initial shipment of dates met their untimely end in Damascus, Al-Faraz remained determined to stock my store. Athir arranged for 10 boxes of dates to be airlifted out of Baghdad direct to New York via DHL couriers for a steep price. The dates ended up being released after 3 weeks, during which the small parcel underwent inspection from Homeland Security, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, the U.S. FDA, and the USDA. Much to the horror of Sahadi's customs broker, some U.S. customs agents determined that the shipment needed to be returned. They believed it was illegal because we were, quote, at war with Iraq. The broker explained to them that we were no longer at war with Iraq, but we were in fact supposed to be rebuilding the company. And so that's Sahadi's shipping center in Brooklyn. And this is the big scandal, these 2 boxes of dates. And then this is me and Patrick Whelan, who's the head of Sahadi's importing. With the dates finally in the store, I changed the sign to read, "Iraqi dates have arrived." Customers flocked in, eager to try the much-awaited fruit that had now interrogated and scandalized every government agency from Baghdad to Damascus to New York. A fruit that asked questions and was astonishingly delicious. We received 4 different types: Azraq, Ashrazi, Ibrahim, and kids with cheese. We received four different types, which you can see here, the different colors: Azraq, Ashrazi, Ibrahim, and Khayara. Close to 100 customers had pre-ordered the individual boxes of dates, orders, of course, no longer possible to fulfill. We limited each purchase to 1/4 pound per person. Shamoun returned for his taste of tikra. It was very emotional for him. He slowly put his first date in his mouth, closed his eyes, and softly said, "This is 46 years in the making." He bought much more than the 1/4 pound limit. When I told Athir how happy the customers were to finally receive the dates, he asked me to take pictures of the customers who had bought them. Here they are. Thank you.
little time for everybody else to say something. Thank you for this presentation. It looks like this issue of design, since this is Graduate School of Design, needs to be touched upon. So if you're saying that you are not a designer, when you're being asked to talk about your projects, but or nor that you are an activist or archaeologist, you are an artist. But at the same time, there are many ways you are a designer, and activist, and archaeologist, and probably more than that. So, but definitely design is something without which you won't be the kind of person you are, and you will not be this kind of artist. So could you elaborate a little bit about this?
Yeah, I think that the projects all kind of have this efficacious thread that runs through them, where there's some sort of an enterprise, you know, whether it's something that's about shelter or something about, you know, reconstructing history as a way to show the void of history. Or, you know, doing something like opening up a shop that does this impossible thing and makes really bad deals, you know, to import impossible items. But that gives me the opportunity to be all those things that you mentioned, but also to not be them, because, like, you know, it's not, I mean, everybody who was in the import-export business would never pay the money that I paid, you know, for those dates. It's a losing proposition. So I get to be the absurd version of those actors. Tradesmen, yeah. And so, you know, it's not an insincere way of wearing those hats. You know, like I'm earnest about making those shelters, and I mentioned in your class before that I've never had more fun at a job than running that shop, and it's too bad it just lost money, you know. But the you know, the design element, I think, is designing in some ways the interaction and knowing that I was going to do something in the case of the dates that was going to essentially build a narrative. And in the case of the like the reconstruction of the artifacts, it was going to make more tangible what was lost. And it's like what since visiting Hiroshima, you know, I feel like people need to visit to understand it. You know, it becomes this abstract thing, but when I was there, the scale, you know, ended up really kind of like making that piece of history that we're taught in textbooks in the United States.
So the way you see the world is, from the point of view of a designer, is the world of processes of production, distribution, and use. And this sounds like what constructivist or productivist artists were hoping for, not to produce objects, but to design the processes of distribution, use, production.
Right.
So that the kind of global approach, complex approach towards the world of objects, right, and networks and processes. Well, it's partial answer, I guess, to the question. Maybe we're just too obsessed with this design here.
Well, I think that it's easy to get obsessed with anything, and you know, the question of naming things, it always ends up being frustrating, because why does it need to be named? You know, I think as soon as the label is applied, it ends up being a lot less interesting. You know.
Okay, that's the answer.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But I have one more question. What's the most satisfactory moment in your artistic?
The most satisfactory moment.
Life.
Like what moment was the
most because you work with people, and you just immersing yourself or bringing yourself to so many situations and people and experiences. I mean, there may be somewhere there is that satisfactory moment, or maybe in some other aspects of the whole art making. And
yeah, I mean, I think there's many. You know, the satisfactory moments can be dispersed. I mean, there's obviously the moments that feel really good, like when the shelter first went up and it worked and it was out on the street. That for me was this moment of puncture where, you know, I was in this public art program and had never made a piece of public art. And finally, you know, it was, there was this whole other notion of it than the kind that I'd been taught in undergrad, which was like designing things for airports and stuff like that. And so there was something that was incredibly satisfying about that. There were moments of satisfaction that came out of Donnie George responding the way that he did to those artifacts, and also knowing that there was a very complex reaction that American audiences were having that kind of took me by surprise, and that there was this feeling of sadness and guilt and complicity. And then in the case of like the store, I felt very satisfied when I told people the dates weren't there. That there was just this expectation that there was going to be a product in the shop, and I loved every frustrating conversation with a customer who told me that like I was running a bad business. You know, so there was something really satisfying about that. And you know, when the dates came in, there was this very beautiful thing that happened when people like Shamoun, you know, tasted the dates. And but for me, it was like, well, I knew at that point the project was done. Like I knew the project was finished. But I would say that like for me, it was all about the anticipation of it never being there. You know, because it speaks about the disappearance and the impossibility to reconcile all those missing bodies. And it was pathetic. It was a total failure. We ended up with 10 boxes of dates, which is, you know, like really very, very symbolic in the end. So there was a large tragedy there. And as much as it could register with people, you know, whether they were frustrated that the dates weren't there, they were also realizing that they were in the same line of cars that all these refugees were in. So I find those moments of frustration and the fact that people might walk away really unfulfilled satisfying, because it wasn't, you know, I'm not looking to basically create this pleasant experience through a public artwork.
But you're helping somebody or something. So in what way and whom?
Yeah.
Is that really true, actually, or yourself?
Well, I don't know. I mean, helping, I worry about that a little bit, because I feel as though it's one of those intangibles in the work where it can help. I mean, but I also knew that it was such an uphill battle with something like the dates. Like Sahani's worked with me, and they were really great, but they were also like, you know, really interested in this being a litmus test to see if there could be a relationship with this company afterward. And they were like so clear that there couldn't be. You know, like it was going, you know, like of course, like privately as a human, I'm like rooting for these dates to get through so that, wow, Iraqi dates are finally in the country after 30 years.
So you're helping the dates.
Helping the dates, I'm helping Thea on the other end, I'm helping there be some sort of reconstruction of an Iraqi industry that has a partner, a big partner in New York. But then it became something that was a losing situation. But then I feel like I've helped soldiers in this sense, because a lot of soldiers wrote to me about the blog we were keeping at Creative Time. And this one guy wrote to me and said that he just gave a PowerPoint presentation on dates using my project to his commander, and basically used it as a way to annoy his commander enough. You know, he kept talking about dates and wanted to help the farmers. And then he talks about the dates, and he's like, look, this guy teaches at a university, I'm not crazy. And then the commander was finally like, fine, go to the farms and help. And so that soldier's been writing to me about like how practical is it to set up the date shop? Could he use my date shop? You know, could he use the address on Atlantic Avenue when he came back? And it was really beautiful, and it was also really sad, because he realized like how much it had actually been this failing business thing, but he's still there. He's working on the farms and getting the date palms planted. There was another soldier who also wrote about the dates, and so in that sense, there are these soldiers that are there, and you know this from some of your work, who think that they're hoping to rebuild Iraq. Mm-hmm. They didn't go. They feel in their own way like they did the right thing by going there. But now they actually are trying to make it so that they can walk away from the situation saying that they did something good. Mm-hmm. So they're starting to get involved in things like industry. Mm-hmm. And if it's not oil, it has to be dates. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How about yourself? You're helping yourself?
Yeah. I mean, I like working. We all work on things that we're interested in to some degree, and it was really, like, my mother was really moved, but also was really kind of, like, dumbfounded that I was going to start up my grandfather's company again, wondering how the hell that was going to work. And then I told her that, I had this grant from Creative Time, and she sat down and did the numbers, and she's like, "You're short $7,000, and I said, "But then I have this grant from the New York Foundation for the Arts for an architecture environmental structure." She's like, "But you have to do a building, don't you? Or you have to do..." And then I had to argue with NIFA, the New York Foundation for the Arts, that the pile of dates was a structure. And that was, my mother really likes that there seems to be no rules, that I'm able to do these things, and I'm not coming home grumpy like her dad used to if business didn't go well.
Home.
Uh-huh.
So there is a home.
There's a home on Long Island where my parents are, but I never feel connected, and I'm in Chicago, and we're trying to feel connected. We're starting to, but there's all these questions, like you used to say, where are you from? Mm-hmm. And so in this sense, like when people came into the store, they're like, "So you're Iraqi, but you're Jewish. How is that possible?" It's like this impossible political shake for them, And I had to explain that, like, it's the oldest Jewish community in the world, and it, up until 1948, when Israel comes into existence,
there was this. Yeah, there was an Arab Jew. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, and so I've never been to Iraq, and it's not home for me, but there's a connection there that, is undeniable, but I also like that being unanswered. Like, as soon as home gets labeled, it feels like something critical will have ended that is an essential friction in a way.
So maybe we should turn to patient. It's quite late, but I'm grateful. We are grateful that we are not alone here that late. So any questions, any thoughts, sharing ideas?
Hi, thanks for the talk. It's really good to see your work told through your words after having seen it before told through other people's mouths. And that's kind of what my question is, you kind of build these narratives and out of all of these different dispersed moments. And it's what's interesting about your process is this cataloging and almost this ethnography of what's happening through this kind of dispersed artistic spatial practice. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit of your engagement with that process and how you feel about building that narrative out of so much material and so many interactions, and then representing it later, and how other people feel about, being represented in that narrative, and in the how you show it in different places.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. This kind of talking through the projects happened, just matter-of-factly after, talking about something like paraSITE, which I'd been speaking about for a while. It was never just the structures. It was like I found, I was telling Christoph's classes before that I found that I wasn't just elaborating on what it meant to build these things or what the materiality of it was. It was the stories of the people who lived in there, who were really kind of amazing characters and gave me amazing information about what it was to live on the streets. And the question of documentation has always come up in my mind because I've always, wondered, oh, shouldn't I be getting this on video or something like this? And it was always something where it felt invasive in a way, or that it would just change the work in a manner that wouldn't allow for me to naturally speak to somebody just face to face. It would always be this mediating thing. So I've never felt good about doing video archiving. And, it's the snapshot. It was like the ability to just quickly take a picture of somebody in the store holding up this pathetic little bag of dates or something. And in Shamoun's case, like at one point, there was somebody from the media who had a camera, and he just shut down, like he wouldn't talk. And so there's always that risk. In terms of the representations of it and how people feel about it, I can answer that question halfway and say that, like, the people that I represent in paraSITE are the only people who have agreed to be represented. And I built a lot more shelters than the ones that are shown there. So I give them that choice. And in the case of something like the Iraq Museum project, well, this was a story that was like, I gleaned a lot of that information from one article in the New York Times that was called The Ghost in the Baghdad Museum, where they told everything. And the part I fixated on was Deep Purple, Donnie George, drums. And I was like, this is insane. And I was like, and I constantly was like, as I knew that he was coming to the States, I'm like, God, is he going to be upset with me about this? Like, this just seems so unfair, And I'm like, no, but it was in the article. It was in the article. I have to trust that, like, this is something he's telling an interviewer. Like, I could see him being the first part of the conversation in a way. So I it's a balance about what it is that you want to, to sort of serve as in this case, it becomes a light moment in the story, but it's also incredibly poetic and talking about the destruction of a building and destruction of the museum. And, so I guess what I'm saying is that, there's always the way the project always grows. And in doing this kind of format, it allows me to continue to pull in things with, these projects that never seem to end and to continue the story. But in terms of the materials that I gather, they're not astonishing materials. They're photographs and documentation of something that you're only seeing the residue of. You're not seeing the work. And so I understand that those are the limitations in those retellings. Does that make sense in answer to your question?
Maybe to continue on that note, but also I imagine, because then there, in a way, these archives of people's reaction, they're also more fragmented. So perhaps they also allow for much more interpretation and sort of develop their own life. So I wonder, maybe as you're in the US and you perhaps are a little bit more in control of the stories that develop out of these fragments, but in Iraq, where you're perhaps not, and perhaps you send some notes back or some pictures, but the people that are involved, it's their everyday life. So I'd also imagine that they talk to people about it. Did you ever keep track of the stories that evolved around your practice that may perhaps be very different?
You mean in Iraq?
Yeah.
You're talking about the store and
or the people that grew the dates, and I don't know to what extent they knew exactly every single step that we were doing here.
Yeah. No, there was a question that came up in the class about, like, how do you present yourself as the artist in the community, and what is the role? And I when I went and I posted on the Baghdad Business Center's bulletin board that I was reopening my grandfather's company and wanted a partner, to import dates from Iraq, I got a lot of answers, and I let them all know that I was, this is actually not my job. I'm doing this as a cultural project. It has the opportunity maybe to turn into something more if we have this partner in the United States named Sahadis, and but I explained that I was an artist. And then Athir, when he wrote to me, said, oh, this is amazing, because my daughter is an artist, she's making pictures in school, and then he asked me how I make my money, and then I mentioned that I was a teacher at university. He goes, oh, this is even more, that we have in common. I was a teacher of physics at the Technical University, of laser physics at the Technical University before the Americans invaded, and now I've become a contractor, which is the modern day version of the importer-exporter. And so he kind of felt like we had all these things in common. And there was a certain point where, like, he was going to the Creative Time website, he was reading the blog, and there was a point at which, he mentioned that he had, when he left Jordan, when he left Iraq for Jordan, he and his family, like his wife and his kids, witnessed a retribution killing. So they were witnesses. So not only did they see something that was dangerous in front of them, they became potential, like, we've got to get rid of these people too. And so when I asked him about the blog, I was like, well, do you want me to use your real names? And he's like, no, please, So we came up with pseudonyms. And so he was Samir, and then this woman named Susan was Rana. And when I went to visit him in Jordan after the project was done, and I spent some days there, he was like, we just read the end of the blog, and he says it's a really nice story the way it ends, but who's Rana and who's Samir, and like, were you working with other people besides us as well? And so I'm like, no, those are your pseudonyms. And he's like, oh, I like Samir, like, and there were like these things where I knew they were keeping track, and then I met some of his friends, and they're like, oh, you're the American artist too, and so they understood my role, and they were discussing it on their end, and they understood it as art, and it was there that I told them about, like, the next exhibition I was doing was the Iraq Museum, and he was really interested in that one because he had formed a human chain around the university in Baghdad when the Americans invaded and everybody was looting. And the American soldiers came over and they saw him outside of the university with everybody, and they said, we're the teachers of the university, we're keeping people from looting. And the Americans were like, get out, leave, and then everything was ransacked. They lost everything. So he felt like this was, like, even though he said, they didn't steal artifacts from us, but they stole an entire school. So, like, now there's, like, no future for all these people who are studying, at every level to the PhD. So there was a way of linking these projects, and he knew, they did research on me the way I did research on them. So in that sense, like, the mediation through the internet became this public domain that was an essential bridge in making this relationship something that happened on an equal footing.
Hi. I've heard a little bit about a bottle cap project. Could you kind of elaborate on that and tell us how that relates to the work that you have shown us today?
Yeah, I'm doing a project in Istanbul that's coming up in November. It was an exhibition called Scramble for the Past. And it's one of those situations where you get invited into an exhibition, it's because of something you did before. And the exhibition is looking at the Ottoman excavations post-1875. And it's really when they kind of looked and saw these foreign empires in Ottoman lands excavating things like the Pergamon altar and bringing it elsewhere. And they're like, we're an empire. We should have an imperial museum, and we have to start holding on to these things and can't just hemorrhage our history everywhere. And so, I didn't want to just simply redo The Invisible Enemy or to show it again, and I did a research trip there and went to the Mosaic Museum. And the Mosaic Museum was really fascinating. They explained in the captions that mosaics have been the same for thousands of years. So it's really hard to date them. So what the archaeologists do is they lift up the mosaics and they look underneath and they find like the shattered pottery and the plates and everything that the workmen had thrown in there, you know. So it's like, you know, this thing where you knock over a wall and you find like a certain wrapper from a fast food restaurant. And you're like, oh, 1982, that was when they were promoting that movie or whatever. And I was really interested in the junk and the matter of fact or the incidental artifact, the one that's not important. And so I'm walking through Istanbul streets and thinking, you know, about the junk that I see in front of me. And I see, you know, all these bottle caps, these blue bottle caps that are used on the water bottles. And there's all these water companies, but they all use this blue bottle cap. And it's like, you know, anywhere from like a royal blue to like a deep blue. And I'm getting distracted in the markets, and I see all the Nazarliks in the shop, the evil eyes that you can buy. They're roughly the same size. They're blue, and they have like the two circles in there that make it an eye. And so I was thinking that like, what could I do to get some of this trash up off the streets, you know, or what would be a way of dealing with this trash, and which was obviously this other kind of archaeology, this detritus. And what I did is I bought 2 paint pens, and I just started turning the bottle caps into Nazarliks with like a light blue circle and a white circle, and it was done. And I went and I showed the curator this, and I said, you know, is the Nazarlik something that somebody would just simply throw away? You know, it's like just something for the tourists. And he was like, no, if you find that, you never let it go. You know, you hold on to it. And lo and behold, I started to graffiti all the trash I found with these circles, and they started to disappear. And so the art organization that I'm working with approached Coca-Cola, which has the biggest water brand there, and they were very excited about the project, and they were going to launch this big, you know, like the most ecological water bottle ever in Turkey. And you know, and they're like, this is perfect because, you know, and I explained to them that like I'm interested in the fact that nobody could throw these away. So there's 2 questions: what do you do with them, and what do you do with all that luck, you know? And so they were gonna they came very close to it happening, but it just got canceled last week because Coca-Cola said it drew too much attention to the fact that it was still a water bottle. Which is insane because they're going to premiere the new water bottle. You know, it's still a water bottle. And now not only can you recycle the plastic, but you can't throw away the cap, you know? Like, what could be better, you know? But they made a dumb decision. So we're looking for another distributor.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.